Welcome back to our journalist roundtable. Let's get right back to it. And Guan, let's move to the South China Sea. The United States Navy has been carrying out what they term freedom of navigation operations near Chinese islands. How have Chinese authorities responded to this?
Well, in fact, Chinese authorities have, of course, repeatedly rejecting such moves, calling that provocative. And also, if you think about it, China really doesn't mind freedom of navigation, or whatever you call it, because Chinese navies patrolled the Alaska area when Obama was there to protest. What China was saying was that it should be conducting the seas as countries can conduct freedom of navigation exercises, but they cannot militarily threaten another country or conduct it not in a good faith. So that's China's concern. Basically, I think this issue is more geopolitics than international law, because and delegitimize each other's claims. But what really happened, I think the U.S. said when China was a World War II ally along with the UK and the Soviet Union, where tested denial of China's claims and therefore the freedom of navigation.
Right. Guan just alluded to this a moment ago, saying that the U.S. Navy is a provocation. Is this Washington flexing its muscle?
Whenever you see a warship go 12 miles towards someone's territory, of course, it can be seen aggressive. Someone this week described to me the freedom of navigation operations as a solution looking for a problem. There has not been any problem of navigation in the South China Sea. The worry is, from the American side, is that they could be because of increased Chinese presence there. But so far, it hasn't happened. And then you've got to think about it. What is the end game here from these freedom of navigation operations? Is there a military solution down the road? Everyone thinks, of course, there isn't. So if you're using military to make a point, how far does it go? And think about this from US allies in the region, and we're thinking about the Philippines here. We have a new president being elected. And even the most hawkish Philippines politicians do not believe that the US would go to war over any islands in the South China Sea backing their allies. So the big question is, how far is Washington willing to go, and will it destabilize the relationship with China and the US? And China, of course, has protested about these sailings of 12 miles near islands, of course, in the Shisha and Nanja Islands, as China calls them. But the biggest problem for China has been the lack of due regard, as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has said, about US ships and aircraft actually buzzing Chinese submarines and shipping off the Chinese mainland coast and Hainan Island. They don't think that's legal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they see more of the same potentially happening in the South China Sea.
And actually, that claim or complaint by the Philippines has led to quite an interesting and somewhat complex legal case. There is this international tribunal, which is sitting in The Hague, which is convened to listen to this case. A decision is expected very soon, in the next few weeks. What impact will any decision have on this?
It will have no impact on these kind of disputes are always solved, bilaterally or in some sort of multilateral format. But when you have a Hague arbitration, it's not going to suddenly, and if it favors the Philippines, for example, I don't think we're going to see Beijing suddenly say, okay,
well, actually,
fine.
Beijing doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of this.
Precisely, yeah. So it will have no impact. It will have no material impact on the ground, or shall we say on the sea.
Simon, why has this become such a big hot-button issue?
Because no one's speaking plainly to each other about what's happening, or certainly they're not doing that in public. Nathan is quite right. One of the questions here is, how far is the United States prepared to go? Well, there are clearly limits to how far the United States is going to go in the remaining months of the Obama presidency, and limits also in the president's seeming willingness to say directly what he means. The United States says, we're not a claimant, this is purely an issue of freedom of navigation and overflight rights, but clearly from the United States perspective, this is a problem because the Obama administration believes that China is trying to expand its territory, but it doesn't say that publicly. And equally, from the Chinese side, there's limits to the way in which these activities are described, and it is going to take, as Afshin said, a multilateral, a series of bilateral or multilateral open discussions to resolve these issues, and those conversations aren't timetabled.
Guan, is arbitration, do you think, going to lead anywhere? Because China's foreign ministry says the country's activities in the South China Sea are legitimate, justifiable. In fact, Beijing blames Japan for what I'd call exaggerating tensions in the region?
Well, I agree with what my colleagues have said. Usually this kind of territorial national security issues, those hardcore issues, are left to bilateral negotiations, not left to third-party arbitration. So according to Article 298 of the UNCLOS, China, along with some 40 Western countries, Denmark, Canada, Australia as well, they ruled out, they have a reservation, meaning they decided that will not accept third-party arbitration on sovereignty.
Right,
So,
UNCLOS, that's the strange-sounding acronym for the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Afshin, Nathan talked earlier on about what is the end game here. I mean, we have this treaty, which is there. Would it be easier for both sides if everybody signed on to this? The US is not a signatory to that treaty.
It certainly would. I mean, the U.S., you're right, is not a signatory to that treaty, and certainly it would lend a little bit of moral authority, to the U.S. position if they had signed on to that treaty. But then again, once again, there's a long history of people ignoring UN treaties. When it comes to, as Guan said, these kind of big, territorial geopolitical issues, you're going to have bilateral, multilateral negotiations. Signing that treaty is the right thing to do. And oddly enough, the past 3 U.S. presidents have advocated for it. It's just sticking in the U.S. Congress, and they're not signing it. Obviously, they haven't advocated strongly enough for it, though.
Okay, finally, let's get to the next big story. Nathan, you first.
I'm going to disagree with the panel and think actually the Permanent Court of Arbitration over the UN Convention Law of the Sea ruling is actually going to be important for several reasons. Look, it's not going to be binding. China is not going to be abide by it. But what it actually might do is actually question historical rights when it comes to sovereign claims in not just the South China Sea, but across the world. And this could be potentially dangerous for any wide-ranging international agreements when it comes to sovereignty. Remember, as Wang Guan said, there are exceptions to sovereignty in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China detailed it in 2006 and, of course, before. But if that is called into question, it weakens the treaty and it also weakens international monitoring this as well. So it could actually lead to a scramble of claims, potentially a scramble of building as well, and also perhaps more legal claims by other claimants as well. So it could end up being quite a mess.
Afshin, what's the next big story?
The next big story, we are entering, the Muslim world is entering Ramadan this next month. So for 1 month, 1.2 billion Muslims will celebrate Ramadan peacefully. They will reflect, they will fast, but Islamist extremists will not be peaceful. If past history is any guide, we will see ISIS step up its attacks. There will be Ramadan offensives. After the most recent killing of the Taliban leader, we are likely to see Taliban potentially stepping up its attacks as well. So while 1.2 billion Muslims will mostly celebrate Ramadan peacefully, expect ISIS to light up the theater as well as the Taliban.
Simon?
The next big story is a story that will render our entire conversation today null and void. U.S. public health... It's a downer. U.S. public health officials warned this week that the world is reaching the end for antibiotics, the first case of an infection that resists the antibiotic of last resort has been detected in the United States. And this is a very, very serious public health issue. If you can't use, if drug-resistant antibiotics get to the point where no antibiotic is powerful enough to beat the infection, we're all in serious, serious trouble.
Well, that's a cheerful thought on the eve of this Memorial Day weekend. But let's go to Guan. What's the next big story?
Every year or every other year, Chinese leadership, top leadership, take this summer retreat to China's Camp David called Beidaihe. There they make important economic decisions, political decisions, and more importantly, personnel decisions. So next year is China's 19th Party Congress, the Communist Party of China, the ruling party. So what will come out of this summer retreat? Who will be governing? Who will be sitting on the permanent seats of the Politburo of the Standing Committee of CPC, which decides how China will be run, is fascinating.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.